Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Krishna C. Nadella, and this is State of Mind. Today's topic is about substance abuse on campus. Substance abuse is a major issue at U.S. colleges and universities. The student culture of abuse of addictive substances and the availability of tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs on campuses across America has resulted in a range of harmful academic, health, and social consequences that extend into the surrounding communities. Back with us a final time to provide her perspectives on the topic is Dr. Arya Soman. Arya, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So before we kick off, I kind of want to at least set the stage. There's some noticeable trends. A study that came out of Columbia University a little less than a decade ago, but still somewhat relevant, showed that there was an increasing trend overall for students in terms of abusing alcohol, students abusing recreational drugs, and then most concerning is the abuse of prescription medication. Specifically, we're seeing abuse of drugs like Percocet, Vicodin, Oxycontin, Ritalin, Adderall, Xanax, Valium, Nembutal, Ciconil. I don't even know what half these drugs are, but this is very much something that I'd like to spend some time talking about. But before we do, with what I just stated, with the trends that were presented, how much of a responsibility do institutions of higher learning have in terms of responding to the problem?
Well, I think that, again, from a technical, legal standpoint, only as much as, if we know that someone is actively using something that's illegal or is not, they're underage, from that standpoint, while they may not have technically a legal larger responsibility, I certainly think that, institutions have, an ethical and societal obligation to, and responsibility to address these things. Again, because this is, I think we would all agree, this is something that's on the national radar, from the highest levels of government to, I think, the members of an individual household. I think that we all have a responsibility, to address it. And specifically in terms of, universities and other sort of institutions of higher learning, I think that also from a safety standpoint, it's important, and that's why they have a responsibility, because, we do often hear, right, that, again, college is a time where people are using, trying new things, using a lot of these different substances, and unfortunately, the consequences of using can be that sometimes people are either experiencing or causing harm. So from a safety standpoint too, I think, they have a responsibility to address it.
Okay, so a little unfair, but I have to ask the question. We asked about colleges, taking care of the issue, or at least addressing it. How much of it is caused by them, the environment itself?
Okay, so yes, that is quite the question. I think that, again, is it caused in the sense that
the melting pot, so to speak,
the
environment.
Exactly, because it's certainly not in the sense that people are.
Stay in school, kids.
I second that. In terms of, they're not actively saying go drink, go smoke, go get high, but in the sense that it is a melting pot. That is exactly one of the reasons why college environments can be, a big factor in use or abuse of different medications or drugs or substances. The fact of the matter is, just literally the way college is structured. Oftentimes people are away from home for the first time. No longer under sort of direct observation and parental supervision and things like that. And then again, developmentally, where people are as far as, transitioning into adulthood, there's still a lot of, excitement and interest in wanting to try new things, some of those new things being substances. There can be a drive to use because of, again, the pressures that students are under, like we talked about, in some of the other episodes, which lead them to sort of self-medicate through substances. And then, there's sort of the side of cultural norms. And the fact of the matter is that college is often associated with, these cultural norms of drinking at parties,
so let's talk about that. We see a lot of societal acceptance, maybe almost a liberal mindset when it comes to alcohol use and abuse in the college setting. Oh, it was while I was in college. I used to be able to drink so much. I used to be able to, take more alcohol than a than a high-speed performance engine, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Why are we so loosey-goosey with, or maybe why is it perceived that we're not taking alcohol abuse as seriously as we see on college campuses, but as society as a whole?
That is a great question. It's definitely something I, as a medical professional, have often sort of thought about because, like you said, sort of from the medical standpoint, physicians and, counselors are taking this very seriously. And from the government standpoint, in terms of SAMHSA and
What's SAMHSA?
SAMHSA is as far as substance abuse, one of the national substance abuse organizations, Substance Abuse and Mental Health.
Okay.
And so a lot of, there are a lot of organizations that are taking it quite seriously, but the issue is right. Societally, culturally, we often don't. And when I think about why, one of the factors that I wonder about is because, it's illegal to drink until you're 21.
True.
Right. So once you're 21, it's not illegal. And the thing is, outside of nicotine, when we think about all of the other things that people are using or abusing, all of those are illicit as far as illegal drugs forever in terms of your whole lifespan. Yeah. And the thing is that when something is legal, the fact of the matter is there's a very reduced risk of perception of harm. Okay. And so, people don't take it as seriously. And then there's also the sort of chicken and egg scenario of, like you said, it's viewed often as a rite of passage. Right. And it's been viewed that way for decades. Right. So trying to combat that and change it to something that's already very, strongly set can also be really hard. And it's not just in college, if you think about society as a whole, right? Like in the movies, on TV shows, when you're talking to your friends, you hear about basically, something really great happened. What should we do? Let's go drink. Right. Something terrible happened. What am I going to go do? I'm going to go drink. Right. So
nothing happened. I'm going to go drink.
I'm going to go drink. Right. Exactly. It's like, what should we do tonight? Right. Let's go drink. So the thing is that, again, it is a problem on multiple levels in terms of what are the factors that make it seem less dangerous.
I worry that the work that's being done by college campuses, that's being done by mental health wellness groups like the ones you mentioned, the biggest struggle will be the students themselves. Because if they don't see it as an issue, then ultimately all the work and awareness that's available will be falling on deaf ears. Do you find that's something of a problem that right now has to start at the individual themselves?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because like you said, it doesn't matter how much information is out there if someone doesn't really either hear it or they hear it, but again, they still just don't believe it. Right. So there's absolutely, there is a key factor of the individual's understanding of, how much does excessive alcohol use really lead to in terms of, negative impacts, both immediately as far as, trouble that they can get into, trouble that they can experience, and legal issues like drinking and driving, things like that, and then the long-term consequences. And I think a lot of times until things come to a head, people just aren't as educated or aware about all of those factors. Okay,
so let's talk about something that's got even less stigma, but more of a concern. Prescription medication. It's available. It's usually prescribed for someone who needs that actual medication for their well-being physically. Right. But I have to admit, Arya, when I was reading these numbers off to you and just some of the names of these medications that are being abused, what is going on? Where is this coming from? And is this something only over the last couple of decades that's really started to increase?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As far as over the last decades, has that been increasing? Yes, I remember when that trend first started coming out and people were really talking about why are people using these medications, right? And also why are they starting to use it at really young ages? We're talking not only in college, but even way before they get to college.
High school.
Yeah, high school, and sometimes even earlier. But definitely in high school. And one of the factors is also that prescription medications, oftentimes people might first start using them because access. You know, they don't necessarily have to go buy it from a friend or from someone that they've heard of in terms of a connection, but they can end up having access to family members' prescription medications that are in the common medicine cabinet, things like that. So I think access can definitely sort of be a factor in terms of first starting to try or use these substances.
Sure.
And then, you know, as that trend grew, then again, there was a lot of diversion of prescription meds where people were getting prescriptions and then selling them because of the street value.
Right.
So,
Talk to me a little bit about that, this market that exists for prescription medication.
Right. There's a huge market for prescription medications in terms of, again, people either buying it off their friends or, again, people actually trying to go to physicians with complaints that would lead to a prescription, for example, for a pain med, things like that, with the purpose of then taking that medication and selling it to make a profit. So the thing is that there's definitely enough sort of market value for prescription meds out there, and it's why sort of over the years, you know, the government has also been really trying to kind of crack down on monitoring and regulating.
We've seen a lot of raids for, I think, OxyContin in particular.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why they, you know, they were working on basically scheduling these medications, making them, you know, that's why they're controlled substances. You know, they can't just. There's a lot more regulation around the prescription of these meds, and doctors are also facing a lot more regulation in terms of, again, like I said, prescribing, but then you need special licenses or certifications to prescribe certain kinds of medications. And then now, like for example, in New York, we all have regulation where we have to always check the state registry anytime we're writing a prescription for, you know, certain kinds of controlled substances, to make sure and see that, you know, this patient isn't essentially doctor shopping and getting multiple scripts from multiple people.
I see. So this is in your day-to-day job. You yourself, as a board-certified psychiatrist, have to do this.
Absolutely.
Interesting. So taking a step back to the originations of when this could potentially start. You mentioned high school, potentially even middle school. I'm sorry to ask, but how much does parenting have to do with this?
I had a feeling you were going there. Well, so parenting, you know, first of all, I do want to say sort of it is absolutely possible that, you know, parents can be the quintessentially perfect parents and still miss signs of abuse. That being said, in terms of factors around parenting that can again, be factors or contribute, again, whether it's from lack of oversight in terms of really just not monitoring, you know, where your kids are because of, again, your personal thoughts about how on top of them you need to be versus, you know, you're working a couple jobs and a couple shifts to put food on the table. In general, just less awareness of where your kids are, who they're with, what they're doing. That can be a factor, because studies have shown that, again, even if you're not physically with your kids, if you know their friends or you know where they are, it doesn't mean, you know, you're monitoring them every second of the day, but just the fact that you know and you're in touch with them and they know that you expect to know those things, that has been shown to sort of reduce risk of riskier behaviors for the kids. So I think factors like that can definitely play into it. And then a little bit like we talked about with some other parenting questions, there are unfortunately, you know, the situations where, again, because parents are such key figures, right? In children's lives, like we look up to and we model ourselves oftentimes on them. So if they're users, right, that's clearly gonna be a gateway. Yeah, and then if you're experiencing, you know, experiences of abuse or neglect, things like that, I mean, that can, again, often lead people to sort of self-medicate through substance use. So,
and I just want to clarify to make sure people understand, even the best of parents with the best of intentions can still have something like this happen to their child, where it flies right under the radar because of something that's much bigger than anything that parenting has to do with it. It could be something that a child's going through physiologically, psychologically, that, again, even the best parents could miss this.
Absolutely. Again, and I'm glad that you mentioned again that there's that range of different experiences, because again, a child's world outside their home is a primary center of their world, but an even bigger primary center, again, through childhood and then through the college years is, again, your school, your peers. And so, you know, there's such a huge influence in terms of peer influence and what your social circle is doing. So factors like that are really big, you know? Yeah.
So let's take a topic that's very poignant and very timely, and one that I think we could talk for hours, but we won't be able to. Marijuana. It is now starting to become legal across the country at a state level. But it's also seen and deemed the gateway drug to many more hardcore recreational drugs that are available, such as cocaine and heroin. Are we at a conflicting apex right now in the country? Because marijuana is something that can be abused, but at the same time, if it's starting to be legalized, where do we go from here in terms of how we address it and how we talk about it? Not just to our children while they're still living at home, but when they're in the college setting as well.
This is definitely a question and a topic that that means a lot to me in terms of this question of legalization of marijuana. I think it is a big concern and a big problem for many reasons, because the fact of the matter is, kind of like I was talking about with alcohol, when something's legalized, there's a huge reduction in the perception of how dangerous it could be, right? So the fact of the matter is, whatever the intentions are behind legalization, it's not really that much of a question of, you know, is this potentially going to lead to a lot more use of marijuana? I think it's pretty much a given that it really can. Already people are coming in to, you know, I've experienced it personally in terms of a lot of people coming to me and saying, well, what's the big deal? It's legal in other states. Why can't I use it? It can't be that bad if it's legal. So I think that the issues are that people don't realize that, I mean, yes, there are studies that show that marijuana, components of it, and that's the key, like there are specific components of it that have been studied for use for very specific medicinal purposes. And I think a lot of times people don't realize that what they're using, or as far as medicinal marijuana, is a different part of it. It contains less of sort of what we know as THC, which is
what stands for?
Tetra. It's a mouthful. I mean, basically, a lot of people.
It's a chemical compound.
It's a chemical compound. A lot of people know it as THC, sort of in the marijuana world, because that's what people are looking at on drug screens and things like that. So THC is a compound in marijuana, and it's the psychoactive compound, meaning that's the part that gives you the high.
Gives you the high.
It gives you the high. It's affecting. It's giving you that feeling that people are looking for when they use. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, a lot of the legalized medicinal marijuana, it contains very low amounts of that, because again, they're working on the parts that are helpful to, you know, patients who are using it. And so that, again, people don't realize that the marijuana you're buying on the street is not the same thing, and it still has the same harmful properties that marijuana has always had.
So let me just reiterate, because this is news to me as well. The legalization of marijuana that's happening across the country, state by state, that is for a type of marijuana that specifically affects people to help them with their pain, with their recovery, and the part of the marijuana that we think of when we associate with getting high is in a very low dosage in this medicinal marijuana.
Yeah, and exactly. With the medicinal marijuana, it's very different. So that's a key difference that people aren't aware of, and then they don't realize, you know, when they're using regular amounts of marijuana, especially now because there's also synthetic marijuana.
What is that?
It's again, it's an engineered
so
plant.
It wasn't actually coming from the natural
process. It's not
process.
a plant, and so it's created. Synthetic marijuana often sort of on in local, sort of on the street, it's known as K2 or spice. And that has, again, much higher concentrations of the psychoactive compounds. And so synthetic marijuana and regular marijuana, they can have major adverse effects too that people don't really always recognize, in terms of, when you're a teenager, when you're a young adult, your brain is still developing, it's still growing, it's still maturing.
Right.
And so these are crucial years still. Like people often think it's just when you're a baby that, your brain's sort of continuing to form, but key periods, especially in terms of executive functioning, meaning decision making, like all of those things that are going to help you succeed for the rest of your life.
Oh,
gosh. Those things are all still maturing. And so if you're using a compound that is actively interfering with that, you're literally damaging your brain.
Oh,
and people don't realize that because they're like, well, it feels good.
Right.
And then for some people, it doesn't always feel so good. Using marijuana can lead to anxiety, to paranoia. There are correlations, again, with regular sort of plant marijuana and sort of synthetic marijuana, even higher with the synthetics, as far as correlations with psychosis, which, like I had said before, is when you can't really distinguish between reality and hallucinations, like delusions, which are false beliefs, things like that. So it's got some pretty serious effects.
I would say, pardon the pun, it's very enlightening what you've been able to share with us. As a parting thought, for parents and then for students, we've talked about alcohol, we've talked about prescription medication, we've talked about recreational drugs. What advice would you give to parents as they have children that are about to enter the academic setting at the post-secondary level? And for students who are about to enter, what advice would you provide to them to help navigate throughout all these stimulants that are available?
So for parents, one thing I would tell them in terms of talking to their children about substance use is that it's really important to be non-judgmental. It's important to not talk to your kids in terms of coming from a place of fear, in terms of, look, just don't do this. Do this, don't do this. They're not going to respond to that as well. And also trying to scare them in terms of, listen, if I hear you're doing something, X, Y, or Z is going to happen. Like, again, that's not an approach that's going to work with a young adult because, again, they're in a place where developmentally, right, they are figuring out who they are. They are transitioning into adulthood, and they are starting to take the reins, right? One of my supervisors, I remember in my fellowship training, had talked to me about, and my peers, about the fact that, as parents, when they're transitioning from having young children to older children, you want to go from being a manager to a consultant.
Ooh, that's good. I like that.
Yeah, that's always stuck with me. And the thing is, that's the tone you want to take when you're talking to your kids. You want to give them the facts. You want to also acknowledge, right, that they're going to start making big decisions on their own, and you are here for them, and you want to support them. You can still be clear that you don't
that you have a stance on something.
Yeah, you have a stance. You don't want them to go use. And this is why, and this is so they have the information. And it's important to also let them know if for any reason they ever ended up trying something or feeling like they were in trouble, right? That even though you don't agree with those decisions, like, you are here to help them. So if they're in trouble, they should talk to you.
Got it. And for students?
So for students, I would tell them that, again, a lot of pressure in terms of using comes from stress, anxiety, things like that. Like, think about what is the reason that you're thinking about using something, and if it's because you're feeling overwhelmed, like, take a step back and see, are there other ways to try to address that? And then in terms of one of the much bigger factors for a majority of young adults, there's the sort of cultural, societal factor. You want to fit in. You want to go to the parties. You want to have a good time. You want to do the things that people think of as far as rich, like, traditions. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the numbers, I think that some of the recent studies I saw were that up to 39–40% of students in college might end up trying something. But the fact of the matter is that means that the majority are not. So you don't have to use something in order to have the experience that you want in school. So I'd say that's a key thing to remember.
Well, Arya, I think that's a very good metric to end our show on, and that the majority actually isn't using, and it's okay to be part of the majority, even when it's not the ones necessarily, partaking of those new experiences.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
On that note, that'll wrap up our show for today. If you like what you saw in today's episode, please like, comment, share, and subscribe on the following social media platforms at the bottom of your screen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, and remember, every life is a book. Make yours a bestseller. Have a good night.